So welcome everyone to the fifth episode of this podcast series called Environmental Justice Litigation. This podcast series is made as part of the student project at the University of Oslo. My name is Iva Svalina and my co-host is Konrad Sandvik. Konrad, who are we talking to today?
Well, today we have an episode that I have been looking forward to for a long time because we are talking to, finally, some economists. We're talking to Mats Greaker and Knut Einar Rosendahl, and together they wrote a review or an assessment of the government's impact report before opening the South Barents Sea for oil exploration. And I have to promise every non-economist listening to this episode, it is way more interesting than you might think. So without further ado, we'll kick it off with the interview. So joining us today, we have two economics professors. We have Knut Einar Rosendahl, and he's a professor at the Norwegian University of Life Science at the School of Economics and Business. And Mats Greaker, he's a professor at Oslo Business School at the Oslo Met. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. And Iva, you can kick us off.
Yes. So we can start with your relation to the Norwegian climate lawsuit. Can you explain how were you related to it?
Yeah, so we were so-called expert witnesses for Greenpeace and Nature and Youth. So we were approached by Greenpeace and asked if we could take a look at this impact assessment that were made by the government before opening this area. So they wanted us to both look at whether this impact assessment did a good job on the economics part, and also whether they took into account CO2 emissions, both in Norway and also abroad in a proper way. So we accepted this question from them, or this request, and looked into the reports and the documentation, and then wrote our own report on this and what we found, and then presented this also in court.
Can you just shortly explain what is an impact assessment and why do we require it?
Yeah, it's required by law that when you open up a new area for petroleum exploration and maybe extraction, exploration, you don't do that if you don't think you're going to extract maybe in the future. It's required by law that you do an impact assessment of all the different effects of opening up this area. And actually in the law, it's also stated what the content of such an impact assessment should be. It's the impact on the environment, it's the impact on the economy, it's the impact on the local economy and the national economy, etc. So it's the impact assessment is very similar to a cost-benefit analysis, but it's not the word cost-benefit analysis, which is used for all kinds of public projects. It's not stated in the law, but this impact assessment is similar to a cost-benefit analysis. So you have to look at the income from the project, and you have to look at the environmental impacts, and also there is specified that you should look at the employment impacts of the project.
And how do you do that? How do you set up and compare cost to wildlife and climate against gains in jobs and export?
You never end up with one figure and says, oh, this is negative, and then you say, this shouldn't be done, or this is positive, this should be done, because it's very hard to actually compare the different figures. But some figures you can give an economic value. For instance, what is the social surplus of developing this oil field? What is the income from the sales of oils, and what is the costs? And some of these costs you can put figures on. Of course, you can put costs on all the capital you have to invest in, and all the people that have to work there. They have their wages, and that's also a cost. And then you have CO2 emissions, and then it becomes a little bit more difficult to value what is the value of the CO2 emissions. But then you have European Emission Trading Scheme, for instance, and the Norwegian petroleum sector participates in the European emission trading system. So then you also have a value on these emissions. But then when it comes to employment activity, then you normally just say how many people will be employed, and it's hard from an economist's perspective to actually value that, because if there was large unemployment, that maybe have a value, but in Norway and in this district, there was no unemployment. So all these workers had to come from other employment, and then, what's the actual value of that? It's not so easy to say. And for all the environmental effects, you normally just describe the effects and then the seriousness of the effects, and then you weigh this environmental effect, which you don't have a number on, up against the economic values. Of course, you could try to put numbers on the environmental effects as well. An oil spill has maybe impacts on the fisheries, and then you can look at the economic profits from the fisheries and say, okay, 10% of this will maybe go away. And you can also ask people, and that's much more common to do, how do you value an oil spill along the Norwegian coast, for instance? How much are you willing to pay to avoid such an oil spill? And there have been investigations on this, and you have numbers for it, also from abroad. But such numbers was not used in this impact assessment at all. They only took numbers for the income and cost directly from the production and from the sales and the production or extraction of oil and gas from these fields. As I remember, they didn't even try to put a number on the CO2 costs. Even that's very normal to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
that's
sorry.
Obviously should do it in this case, actually.
Yeah, because one of the things that surprised me as well in your findings was that the government had done, as you said, they'd put up the cost of developing the oil field and the income from exporting oil. But is it correct that they did not discount any of the future earnings? If you can explain first, like, what is the concept of discounting, and if they did do it here or not?
Yeah, so discounting is very crucial in any project, not only in this context. So it means that that money that you have today is always more worth than money that you get in the future. So 1 million today is much better than 1 million in 2030, because if you have this million today, you can invest it and you can earn interest on this money, and then in 2030 you will have, most likely at least, much more than 1 million. So that's why when you compare income and costs in different periods, in different years, in a specific project, or in this case in searching for oil, developing oil fields, and then after 10 to 15 years, maybe starting to earn revenue, it's very important that you discount the future income and also cost, so that if you have 1 million earnings in 2030, and then this is worth less than 1 million when you compare it with the current cost, for instance. So if you have 1 million cost today and 1 million revenues in 2030, then that's you will go with a deficit. What do you call it?
Deficit.
You will lose deficit. Yeah, you will lose money actually.
So in this case, the government did not discount future income?
No, they didn't do that. They just summed all the revenues and, without taking into account when the revenues came, and also summed all the costs over all years without taking into account when the costs were. And then they took the total revenue minus the total cost and presented that as a sort of a net income. And that's an error.
Yeah, it's shocking to me. I have to say, because in our I'm a master student of economics, and in public economics, we almost everything we talk about is the present value of projects, and as you said, a cost-benefit analysis. And they've used examples like if you own 1 million ice creams and you get an offer to sell all of them today for one price, or you could like rent a shop and rent a freezer and pay for staff to sell them over 10 years. You can get 1 million kroner for them today, or you can get 1.1 million in 10 years. Which one do you choose? And it seems obvious that you would have to take into account such a basic thing as discounting income that comes in the future, because it's also uncertain, as you said, talking about the oil price that we don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the more uncertainty there is, the more you should probably discount the future expected revenues. And there are also rules for this in the government. So the Ministry of Petroleum, for instance, they normally have a certain discount rate that they use when they are considering specific projects, like if there's a new field that the companies want to develop, and then they have to hand in a plan for development, and then they have to discount future income, like you presented, and make a net present value calculation. So this is they always do that, but they didn't do it in this particular opening case. So it's very strange, and it's a big error.
And if there is one area where they almost always do it, it is like in the cost of climate change and the mitigation strategies, right? Like it's too expensive to do something about it today because the effects or the costs of it will come a long way in the future, so we don't care as much about them. Now you can argue whether that's a good thing or not. In dealing with climate change, there's a lot of debate of maybe you should not discount as much, of course, but when it comes to extracting oil, that might be the wrong end of the equation to start not discounting in. It seems to me.
Yeah, that was. I totally agree, and this is a kind of business proposal in a way. It's for Norway. It's starting up an oil field. You have income in the future. You have high costs now. The government is very involved because of the tax system. So the government has to pay a lot of the costs up front because the oil companies can subtract all the costs and then reduce their current taxes by a large amount. And then you have in the future, you will have this income, and then the government start to earn money because they then have the high taxes on the profit in the future. So it's a business proposal, and they should, of course, discount it. Because what we discovered when we discounted was that there were two scenarios that they looked at. There was one scenario with large oil deposits, oil and gas deposits. So you had luck in a way. You found a lot of oil and gas, and then looks like there are some scale advantages. So then there was the current value of the project was positive. But then if you didn't have this high, if you had the other more low scenario, we only found gas as far as I remember, and then the current value of the project was very close to zero, and why should you then do it in a way in the special situation we are? So in the low resource scenario, this project didn't look good at all, and of course when you didn't discount, then it also were positive for that scenario. So then you could present for the parliament, you could present, oh, even though we don't find so much, it's still a positive revenue from the project. But it would maybe have been harder to get the project through if in a low scenario you would not actually earn anything on opening up this area. So I don't know, but I suspect that it was deliberate that they wanted not to discount because they wanted to have two positive revenue streams from this opening up this area.
And just from your answer earlier, that number that then would be negative, that is even not including environmental costs as a post in that equation. Is that correct? since you said they did not use monetary values on those?
Can you remember?
I don't recall the numbers now because we also looked at the different discount rates. But I think maybe with when we use the discount rate of 7%, which the ministry usually applies, and we also deducted the value of CO2 emissions in Norway, then I think at least it became negative. Maybe also before this deduction of CO2 cost in Norway. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about risks of oil spills and local impacts.
Yeah, these, of course, are not calculated. So, of course, and that's why when you get these very big numbers, billions of kroners that you can expect, and you compare it with the other negative things, that's more difficult to quantify. And then, of course, when the money figures looks very big, then it's more tempting to say yes, and sort of, even though there are some negative effects. Well, if they have calculated correctly and the monetary effects have been then shown to be smaller but still positive, then maybe this could tip the other way, because then the negative effects could then have maybe dominated, even though they were not calculated or quantified in monetary terms.
So you can not think of any good reason why they wouldn't discount, is that correct?
I cannot think of any good reasons, no. One reason that they mentioned, that the minister mentioned, was that this is so uncertain that he didn't see the point, I think, in discounting, since the numbers were so uncertain. But of course, when you present some numbers, then you should discount them anyway. If there is so huge uncertainty, then you shouldn't present any numbers at all.
Yeah, because usually we say that uncertainty would pull the number down, right? Because it is by definition uncertain, or do they think that it might be a lot more, or it might be a lot less, and it's so it might vary so much that we have actually no idea how much it would be. Is that the argument then? We don't really have an idea, so it doesn't even matter.
Yeah, it's difficult to speculate, of course, but they also put forward that it's the companies who will eventually decide whether they will start exploring and start developing, and they're saying that the petroleum tax regime is neutral, but as we show, it's not fully neutral, and there are also these other environmental impacts that Mats talked about that they don't take fully into account. So I think that argument is also not really valid.
I also think there is a contradiction in these arguments, because the government actually spends quite a lot of money in making this impact assessment. It's not like it's only employees in the Ministry of Oil and Energy that does this. They hire in a lot of consultancy firms, different consultancy firms. Some consultancy firms made the employment investigations, and other consultancy firms looked at the environmental impacts, and also the oil directorate looked at the prospects or the revenue streams, etc. So they actually spend resources on making this report. And if you don't know anything anyhow, then that is waste in a way. Then why do you do it at all? Then you might as well say, hey, it's impossible to know anything, so let's open and see if there's any oil there, and then make a decision afterwards. So I think that's a contradiction in itself. Of course, you can know, you have a lot of experience now. We have developed a lot of new fields over time. So in Norway, so you should have experience of evaluating in the field before it's developed, and that can say you that could tell you something. And if it's a negative downside, you might as well wait with opening it. And it's true what Knut Einar said, that the private firms, as the tax system was, and especially as it is just now, it's not a neutral tax system. It's actually subsidies to the oil companies, and then of course you cannot just say that if they want to go for exploration, then it's good for society. So we can say yes, because in the current tax system, which will not last for very long, but still holds for, I think, all projects that are accepted through this year, and even if they're not carried, what?
Next year, even next year.
Even if they're not carried out next year, but just accepted. So it's a large subsidy to these projects, and so you actually have to do such an impact assessment properly before you do it, if you plan to sort of subsidize oil companies afterwards.
Because then an outcome that could be quite likely here is that companies go in and start extracting because of the subsidies and do a project that is actually a net negative for society.
Yeah, that's a great danger now, especially with this new petroleum tax system that that was temporary but still holds. That went through the parliament spring 2020, wasn't it? Then so that's a big danger, that we now do a lot of oil projects that is not socially beneficial but only privately beneficial, and that's actually an absurd situation to be when we have the climate challenge, and Norway is going to be a leader in the fight against climate change, and then with the left hand just subsidizes oil projects.
Yeah, and you also talked about that we did not account for any cost of carbon of the oil that we are extracting, as you said, even when we're talking about global climate crisis, where we want, at least a lot of Norwegian want us to take initiative, and we know that we need a change. But it seems like all the errors you found in this reporting pulled towards drilling for more oil, opening more areas. How do you have any assessment of why or how that happens? Why we are where we are today?
It's difficult again, but it was a bit. So all the errors or all the biases that we found went in one direction, either by overestimating the positive side or underestimating the cost side. So we found it at least a bit strange, but of course it's difficult to know why exactly this happens. Yeah.
And it seems like I'm sorry to say, you don't have to say that, but I will say it seems like very poor workmanship from the people that made the report. And you're talking about an spreadsheet error that added like 100 million kroner or something to that wasn't there. Yeah, can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, so that was it was a very strange error in the Excel sheet that they used. So some of the numbers they presented, I think, so they counted some of the revenues twice. That was by accident, definitely. But eventually, it didn't turn up in the last result when they presented the net income. Then somehow this error disappeared. So it's a bit strange. But so I think this process went rather quickly. Also, at least that's what we've heard. The whole process was very, very rapid. So they have had little time, but still, that's not an excuse for lack of discounting, at least. But maybe maybe could explain some of it.
Because
there was kind of the government at that time that was a Labour Centre Party, Socialist Party government, and they were very, as far as I remember, they were very proud of this new agreement with Russia, so that you finally had a line and you divided the Barents Sea between Russia and Norway, and that was finalized. And then I think the government had they wanted to show that this agreement in a way was a big benefit for Norway, and now they could start up with oil exploration in this area, which was contested before the agreement, whether it belonged to Russia or Norway. And then they wanted to have some activity in the northern Norway, and I think that was, and they actually pushed through this. That's just speculation, but it looks like that. But I'm very glad I was involved in this work, because I got pretty disillusioned by the work, I must say, because the politicians, like when they have discussed opening up the Lofoten and Vesterålen area for oil exploration, they've always said that, yeah, you know, we haven't decided to open up, but we will have an impact assessment, and then we will look at the impact assessment, and then we will decide. And then we will have an objective or neutral impact assessment, and that will be a wonderful document for making the right decision. Like that's the way they have debated all the time. So it's like, we're not opening up, we only want an impact assessment. But after having studied this impact assessment, I think that they cannot be trusted. This impact assessment, it's just a kind of brochure for opening up a new field. So I can better understand the political parties that say that we don't want an impact assessment, because it's not done properly. I think maybe it should be said somewhere that it should be done like a cost-benefit analysis. I think it's a kind of hybrid, and because in the cost-benefit analysis you wouldn't count positively just employment, because as long as this employment is not net new employment, it's just moving people from one business to another, you wouldn't count it as a benefit. But they do it in this impact assessment. So everything is sort of geared towards opening up, I think. I think this should be changed, and you should more look at it like a normal cost-benefit analysis.
And when you add, as you say, all the errors that only pull one direction, it seems, just to support your previous statement, that it seems like the politicians just want the assessment to say that it has been done, and then we'll open up anyway, and the companies will do what they feel are right afterwards.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, excuse me, you can go on.
I think it's also very hard to, if you open up, you sort of set off a cascade effect, like then the companies invest money in exploration, and then if they want to go on without taking other environmental impacts properly into account, you sort of in a way you've tied your hands to say yes as well, because you already had some costs. Of course, you should say no if the projects are not socially profitable afterwards, but it's harder because you've already spent a lot of money in exploration, which are sunk cost, and you have this sunk cost fallacy, something called that if you spend a lot of sunk cost, you tend to make wrong decisions afterward, because you want to have something good out of it, even though it's not profitable. So I think it's very important to do a proper impact assessment before you open up.
So you mentioned discounting employment effects, but can you say some other flaws which you found in the assessment?
So we talked about these carbon emissions briefly. So the fact that they didn't count the cost of carbon emissions in Norway, that's also a clear error, because not only because we want to save the world, but because we have climate targets in Norway, and to reach these targets there is a cost involved. So then you need to deduct these costs in a proper assessment, and this was not done. They presented some figures about the emission level, but they didn't count as a cost, so that's a clear error. In addition, they didn't look into CO2 emissions abroad, and whether that is an error or not can be discussed. So we also calculated these emissions and tried to put a number also on to try to calculate the cost of these emissions. This is a bit more difficult to know whether you should have included them, but I think at least such an assessment report should also include some discussion and some tentative numbers about these emissions, because these emissions are much higher than the emissions from the extraction in Norway. So
how do you put the price on the carbon in this case?
Yeah, so that's not obvious what price you should use. So now recently the Ministry of Finance have actually come up with some recommendations for that, but that's now this fall, so then that was not available in 2013. But what we did was to argue that the most relevant CO2 price is to use CO2 prices that are consistent with reaching this 1.5 or 2 degrees target that the global community have agreed upon. So how high must the CO2 price be globally to reach these targets? So we applied these kind of numbers to calculate the cost. But this could be discussed also. What is the correct price?
In what direction do you think that this flaws pull the outcome of the report?
Well, it's the same way that the other flaws, actually, by underestimating the cost and overestimating the benefits. So we did some calculations, and emissions in Norway were, at least with the prices we applied, that we thought was correct. It meant it was not marginal numbers. In some scenarios, I think the net value went from plus to minus. But then the emissions abroad counted even more, and we included them.
Because people seem to not be able to agree as well on whether, if it is we or somebody else that supply the oil, that should that reflect on us or not, and if we reduce our supply of oil, will that even affect the global supply of oil? Of course, we have some comments from some studies funded by the oil industry as well on that topic, but I don't know if you have any comments on that area.
Yeah, so it's not. It's a bit difficult to know how much emissions abroad will be reduced or increased when we increase our oil production. So we used numbers from a study that I was involved in some years ago for oil. But then, as you mentioned, there was a recent report now from Rystad Energy where they come to a different conclusion. Still, most likely that more oil production in Norway gives higher emissions abroad, but they found smaller effect than we did in our article. So this is so how big these effects are. That's uncertain, but it's very likely, I would say, that more oil extraction in Norway leads to more emissions globally. For gas, it's more an open question. So for gas, we didn't do such calculations because there we think emissions can go either up or down. It's difficult to know the sign of the effect.
So bringing this back to the court case, which has been like the center of our project here with our several interviews, do you feel that these flaws that you uncovered had any impact on the decision of the court?
I was much of the court case, probably you know better, took place around the law aspects of this paragraph 110 or 112 in the Norwegian Constitution, this new paragraph, and whether this was more like an what you call a propaganda paragraph that didn't have any legal content. It was more like some program. I think that's the word they say. So the politicians wanted to say that they mind about the environment, but it didn't really have any real substance. And so the government, the lawyer of the government, he was arguing very hard in court that this was just a propaganda paragraph and didn't have any legal implications. And on that case, he actually didn't win. I think the court, both in the at first level and the second level, was very clear on that this paragraph could have some legal implications, but still not in this case, because then the argument was that Norway is doing so much to reduce their emissions, so you couldn't actually say that Norway was failing with respect to climate change. But then the other part of the court case was that if there was some error in the material that was presented to the parliament, that could have maybe changed the decision in the parliament. And then, of course, there was an error in the material, several errors, as we have pointed out. But I think the court, I was a bit disappointed, especially with the High Court, because they didn't really take it serious that this impact assessment hadn't used current value estimations, and had discounted future income streams. And said then something about it could be pedagogic not to do it or something. It's very strange that you do a clear. It's like saying 1 + 1 is 3 because it's more pedagogic than saying 1 + 1 is 2. In a way, it's a sort of relativity in. Yeah, I was very disappointed with that decision. Because that they didn't pay any attention to these clear wrongs, and actually the court could have said and have decided that okay, this was so many faults in the material that was presented to the parliament, so we have to have a new round in the parliament, and that would have worked. Would of course have been very serious for the Minister of Oil and Energy, and would probably have improved all the future impact assessments seriously if they had made that a decision. But they didn't do it because they argue that even though they had used the current value estimation, the parliament would have voted for anyhow. But of course you don't know that. How can you know that? How can you know this history that never happened? So I think the court, they said the numbers were uncertain, but at the same time they were certain about something that never happened, certain that the parliament would have voted yes anyhow. So I think that was strange.
Yeah, I was also surprised, or I think it was of the little economic competence in the Supreme Court from the majority, like Mats explained. But I also noticed that the minority in the Supreme Court, they focused on these emissions abroad from Norwegian oil extraction, that these also should be taken into account, as far as I understood it at least. And that was an interesting thing that, I mean, not only we, but also other experts, of course, in the court talked about these emissions abroad from Norwegian oil extraction. So at least it seemed that this focusing on emissions abroad got some traction in the court.
So what does what does that say then about the court's ability to hand out judgments in cases like this? Because it seems like they, with all due respect to the courts, have, as you say, very limited economic understanding.
It's difficult again, I think, to answer, but yeah, I would expect that they have economic competence around, even though they are lawyers themselves, that they have economic competence. But I'm not sure how that works. But I must say I was surprised by how these economic calculations were presented or talked about by the court. But yeah, I'm not a lawyer, so it's difficult.
So I will just. Sorry, Mats, you can go.
I was also very disappointed with the courts, with their understanding of the current value concept. and that they just said that it's more pedagogic, could be more pedagogic. It's sort of a kind of disrespect for economic sciences in a way. So, but at the same time, I know that all the judges in the courts in Norway are really competent people, and they have they're intelligent, everything. But maybe there is something wrong also with the law. That maybe there is something wrong with this description of the impact assessment. Maybe it should say that it should follow the procedures of a cost-benefit analysis, because then the High Court couldn't have said anything else than this hasn't followed these procedures, and then it's wrong, and then you have to do it again, and we have to make the decision again. Maybe the law is not good at that point, because it's often so that when you get judgments, you should go back and look at the law more thoroughly. Judgments that you feel is wrong in some way. So yeah, that's some reflections I've had afterwards, that the law about impact assessment is not good, because the concept of the impact assessment is too flexible. So you should put it more into the economic sciences.
Yes,
that's just a reflection I have.
Yes, and that's also the thing which, as Knut mentioned, judges couldn't agree on, because I think 4 of the judges gave dissenting opinion because they were interpreting CAI directive differently when it comes to the procedural aspects of the impact assessment. So maybe the law is not good enough, or they cannot find the correct way to interpret it also.
Yeah.
But would you say that the government would not have approved the project even if there were not errors?
I think they would have approved it anyway. That's my guess, because the majority in the parliament have been very pro-oil activity, petroleum activity. So I think they would have wanted to go ahead, even though the economic prospects were not very high. But I think that's also what the Supreme Court were building their decision upon, that there's been a history of approving such opening of new areas and approving new developments, and there's a big majority behind, or big consensus around the main petroleum policy in Norway. So yeah. I think so, but of course it would have been more debate at least, and more discussion about, do we really want to do this? So yeah, so it's difficult to know.
Do you have anything to add, Mats?
Not really. I tend to agree with Knut Einar at the environment at that point, and was to just agree. But you don't know, of course. You don't know if there were negative numbers. Maybe there would have been a bigger debate. Maybe the socialists in the government would have put their feet down more. I don't know.
But it seems then that even the court agreed that the impact assessment almost does not matter. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, unless they discover or uncover some very crucial things. So, for instance, they work a lot on the environmental impacts, on describing impacts on birds and everything. And of course, if they had uncovered some really bad, really risky things, then maybe things could have been different. But I think, yeah, otherwise, I think it was a quite... and I also think it was like a compromise in the government. So the Socialist Party, they got some part of petroleum, and then the Labour Party and the Centre Party got Barentshavet. So there was a compromise also, which made it difficult to get a different decision in the parliament. Since this was since the government had the majority in the parliament also.
Yeah, because in the end of the day, it's politics, not just economics. So
yeah.
So we will let you go in a minute. We've taken a lot of your time now. I see look at the clock, But before we wrap up, we've often asked the law professors that we talk to what they think the role of the judicial system is when it comes to climate activists. And we would like to pose that to you, what you think the role of economics is in terms of a climate activist's toolkit. Does it have any utility?
I actually think so. I think economics has a lot to contribute. Also, I think climate activists should pay attention, because I think it's always very important when you want to reduce emissions to try to reduce emissions in the most efficient way, in the most cost-effective way, taking into account dynamic effects through technological development, etc. Of course, not only static. But I think still it's very important to analyze the effect of different measures and see how much bang do you get for the buck, or how much emission reductions do you get per krona, because it's very important. If you don't get high emissions reductions at the same time the policy is very costly, you will nearly, I guess everything it runs the risk of stopping up. So I think economists have a lot to contribute to discuss the different measures that you utilize.
And we are also used, at least when we are environmental economists, that we used to also bringing in the cost of environmental damages, the cost of emissions, that this has a cost to the society, and then it needs to be reflected also in like impact assessment like this. We need to account for also these costs, not just the revenues from the oil extraction. And also, of course, in other discussions of environmental impacts, like talking about biodiversity and the nature crisis also, that using or exploiting the nature, exploiting natural resources, it should be costly. You should have to pay for it. It shouldn't be taken for granted, or you shouldn't just use it for free. So there, I think economists can have something to say or help the activist.
Yeah, so I then want to wrap up this conversation by saying thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your insight and your work in this area. So I think at least it was a very very interesting and fruitful conversation. Thank you a lot.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you too.
Okay, have a nice weekend.
Also.
Goodbye.
Okay, I think we gained some really useful information out of this. And Konrad, I'm sure you have a lot of things to comment on.
Yeah, I mean, where to start? It's just such a huge bag we've uncovered here, I think, like just with the court's inability to understand like simple economic concepts, and then of course all the errors they found in the original report, just pulling in one direction towards more oil drilling. I think it's just horrendous, and it's not a good time to uncover these things, but I think it's very helpful to understand better what climate activists are up against. So I think it's also important to realize the perspective of these economists, and also one that we heard from Professor Sjåfjell, which was that the court could, even though they might wanted to side with the government, they could have made a ruling that would have set certain standards for future environmental impact reports, or had a judgment that made more room for this to be a viable path for future lawsuits, or that could improve the standard of future environmental impact reports, but they chose not to, and here we are. So yeah, I think it's bleak, but I'm really glad we had this conversation as well.
This was actually the last episode of this podcast series.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have some additional bonus episodes, and we hope that you enjoyed this podcast series and that you learned something out of it. We know we did, and thank you for listening.
Bye.